more competition and generating more revenues for yourself. That is a principle that's implemented in many contexts, but one example recently is that in the spectrum auctions, they're basically going to, rather than just have one overall clearing price, they're actually going to like penalize people who would be very likely to want to sell their spectrum back to the system in order to get them to accept a lower price. Yeah,
so,
Mohammed?
The way you are suggesting that, like, we ask some people they have to overbid the other person more than a margin.
Yeah.
Like, is it by identifying them or by implicit?
No, identifying them.
Oh.
Yeah, that's a third-degree price discrimination. Yeah.
Otherwise, like, we may end up not selling the item.
Yeah.
Like,
No. I mean, there's no way without explicit information to do this type of discrimination.
Right, so you're saying that for each bidder, you give them a different like amount that they have to outbid the previous.
Yeah.
Does
I mean, you could even do it. It depends on which bidder happens to be the second bidder, right? So I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can do it. I mean, I think the optimal system requires that you take the marginal revenue associated with any person, derived from their distribution of valuations, and you have people report their valuations, and you award the object to the person with the highest marginal revenue, and then you don't award it if everyone has negative marginal revenue. So the reserve price overall corresponds to not awarding it to people who have negative marginal revenue, and the individual specific handicaps correspond to the differences in the marginal revenue curves associated with different people. So in general, you won't want to have a fixed amount that someone has to beat them by, because my marginal revenue curve might have different gaps between my value and the marginal revenue at different parts of the curve. And so it could be that, like, I have a very elastic demand curve at high willingness to pay. I'm not going to be willing to pay more than $10, but I'm very likely to be willing to pay something close to $10. So I wouldn't have to bid that much more than the person if I bid above $10, but I would have to bid a lot more than the person if I'm trying to bid below $10, right? So in general, you want to take into account the full shape of that stuff. But sort of the basic principles are simple things like this. Yeah, Mohammed.
Is it useful when, like, we have some more than one item to sell, or?
Absolutely. That was the example of the spectrum auction, right? There, many people can sell their thing back to the system, and we sort of have a clearing price, but the clearing price penalizes. Like, you might have a clearing price per score that you get, and the score that you get might be determined by the system. And that forces people who are willing to pay, or who are willing to accept less in order to sell their stuff, to sort of like bid more aggressively. Okay, so I just basically described all this stuff. So notice that this has welfare implications that are very similar to standard price discrimination. Because in the absence of being able to, like, induce this extra competition, I might want to set a higher reserve price to extract from those people who are likely to be willing to pay the most, right? But that would have the cost of, if those people happen not to be willing to pay, to giving it to no one. By inducing this competition and maybe inefficiently sometimes allocating it to the second highest willingness to pay person, I increase the chance that I allocate it to anyone at all, right? And so it really is exactly the same as third-degree price discrimination. It might have costs because sometimes you move it from the highest willingness to pay person to the second highest, but the benefit is that you exclude less people from the market entirely very often. Okay. So I think one particularly interesting application of price discrimination is criminal justice. So Becker famously argued that criminal justice is a lot like the monopoly problem as well. Mike, what did he say about that?
Well, it's similar because you have, I mean, there's an effect on society from these crimes, and there's this cost to society of handling those, and it's different across the different types of criminals that you have. So then you can, and the justice system has done this, like creating different punishments or different regulations for certain types of criminals.
Yeah.
And like in doing that, you're able to reduce the overall like amount of harm given certain characteristics of different people.
So the key point that Becker made was that when we impose like a fine, the money that we raise off that fine is just redistributed to somebody else, right? And so there's no efficiency loss associated with just taxing someone effectively, right? And that means that we don't need to worry about how much people respond to that tax when we set it. We just set it equal to whatever the harm is, right? And that solves the problem. In criminal justice, that's not the case for two reasons. First of all, when I punish you, that doesn't create value for anybody, right? That creates a harm on you, but it doesn't create an offsetting benefit for me. So there's a social loss immediately to inflicting punishment. And second, it's often costly for me to punish. I have to build jails and all this sort of stuff. So we want to try to minimize the amount of punishment that's going on, while at the same time deterring as much crime as possible, right? And so the more elastic criminals are with respect to crime, the more we want to punish, right? We don't want to punish in cases when they're inelastic, because then we're inflicting punishment without gaining the benefit of reducing crime, right? So different circumstances may imply different elasticities, right? And punishment should be meted out depending on the circumstances. So what are some examples of that, Chrissy? Ways that our justice system effectively discriminates based on how elastic you were likely to have been to that punishment. How likely you were to have been deterred.
I mean, I'm just thinking about fines in general.
No, don't think about fines, because fines don't have this issue, right? In fines, we just set it equal to the level of the harm. I want to think about cases when we're punishing in an inefficient way or costly way.
Okay,
Yeah.
so, yeah, when you, I don't know, like when you flog people publicly, you do something that would also embarrass them by like maybe making them identify themselves as criminals after their punishment has already been served. So that just creates some, I mean, you could argue that maybe
Well, jail is inefficient. Just jail itself is inefficient, right?
People are working and maybe earning some.
Yeah, but that's probably very small relative to what they would make outside, no?
Yeah, I mean, I'm unaware of the value of
It costs so much to put people in jail. It's like $100,000 a year, which is...
Yeah, like at the beginning of the paper, I think Becker proposed in the 60s, there were
Yeah.
just all these huge losses. But you basically are paying for people to have housing.
But the question is, how do we discriminate against people based on how likely they were to have been deterred? How does our justice system do that? Can you think of any example?
I mean, are you trying to get me to talk about how like risk averse versus like risk loving criminals and not selecting into crime?
No, I'm asking you to say, how does our justice system, the way that it's set up legally, give different punishments to people based on how likely they were to have been deterred by the punishment?
So, like, based on their income, like if there's a fine set for their crime, then people who are already like too poor to pay for that fine get put into prison versus people who can pay for the fine.
But those people probably aren't more likely to be deterred. Anyone?
I'm just like
thoughts? Eric?
Does this have anything to do with bail? I don't really know how bail works, but...
Maybe. I haven't thought about bail in relationship to this. Say more.
Well, the idea is that, when you like, someone can pay bail when they're like arrested for a crime, but they haven't been charged yet. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So, if it's someone who values being in, really doesn't want to be in jail and they have a lot of money, then they can afford to pay the bail and leave. But it.
Well, so I think that's not quite right, but I think you're onto a good track, which is that people who probably haven't committed the crime are going to be likely to be willing to pay bail because they know they're going to get out anyways and be able to pay back whatever the bail bond was, whereas people who have committed. So I think that's closer to it. But Jim, did you want to?
Well, like, different levels of crime. So like if you commit premeditated murder versus you just hit someone in a crosswalk by accident.
Exactly.
Then you're going to go to jail a lot longer.
Yeah, so we discriminate based on like the age of the offender, the degree of the murder, or like people being insane. Because we think that people who are young, who didn't premeditate and so forth, are unlikely to have been deterred by the prospect of punishment. And so it's not worth punishing those people because the fact that they're going to get punished wouldn't have influenced whether they committed the crime or not, right? So that's a classic example of third-degree price discrimination in how we think about, in how we give punishment out for different crimes. Yeah?
Isn't there also an externality problem with like some criminals we don't want like on the street, right?
Yeah.
So like serial killers or something. So jail isn't necessarily as inefficient then, right? Because
Yeah.
we're helping a negative externality by keeping them locked up.
Yeah, I think that there's some truth to that. I mean, I think there's one view of crime which is sort of like the action inducement view, which comes out of Becker, which is that we want to deter people, that people are more or less homogeneous. Another view is that people are very heterogeneous, and there's some people who are just like we want to get rid of, right, in society, but we're not willing to euthanize them. So we.
That would be
Or maybe we are depending where we live.
Yeah. Yeah. Eric.
This is a bit of a, could you go back a slide?
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is just me thinking about, I would argue that all three of those points, right, the age of the offender and like how bad the murder is actually part of the crime's cost to society. For example, locking up a young person is much more costly to society than locking up an old person because the young person, they have a lot of things they could be doing.
Mm-hmm.
Also, like how premeditated the murder is,
Meditated
murder is, also affects how like drastic it is, right? If someone gets hit in a car crash or if someone gets killed in like a brutal murder, right? It's like very different effects to the friends and family of that person.
I think there is a little bit of that, but I think that like someone getting killed in a bar fight, not that different than someone getting killed in cold blood and along those dimensions. I mean.
I guess. I can see how this is also price discrimination,
Yeah.
but do you have any examples that aren't ambiguous like that? Something that's very clearly just price discrimination?
I mean, temporary insanity, I think, is a pretty good example of that. I mean, temporary insanity is basically saying, like, this is not reflective of the, like, this person was in a state such that they couldn't possibly have been deterred by the prospect of punishment. I mean, there's also the issue there that they're probably not dangerous afterwards or something like that, but yeah.
I mean, I guess to carry out like number 2 really into all of
Yeah.
The murder mystery, the fatal equilibrium, is like written for economic students. Like it tells you the fatal equilibrium is when you realize the benefit of killing somebody is greater than the cost of killing them.
There's a murder mystery called The Fatal Equilibrium for
Yes,
Econ
and
students?
it's written by Jevin Marshall, or Marshall Jevins.
I thought it was a bad book.
Well, whatever. Sanderson makes all the students read it.
I see.
And it has all these little economics examples throughout, but people are getting killed, and it is very premeditated, and you're sort of like, see, there's this sociologist who's...
So then you're highly elastic, right? Because if you change the... Yeah.
I mean, that's what this guy's little blurb is about,
Yeah.
the murder. It's like, oh, okay, I see that I'm not going to, like, exceed my marginal cost of killing the person.
So there's also a book called Murder on the Margin by the same guy, and he wrote The Fatal Equilibrium because people were like, well, people don't always make decisions on the margin. Sometimes there's like a flipping point. So he wrote The Fatal Equilibrium. That's really good.
Okay. So, as illuminating as that was, let's move on. Okay, so let's turn to the intensive margin, where you care about per customer profits, right? So the standard lever to try to affect this is nonlinear tariffs. Different prices are charged for different numbers of units that are purchased. And